Multilingualism Matters Spring Colloquium. And we hold this opportunity every other year. And are we okay? Okay. Every other year. And next year, we will hold our conference in town. So we're asking you to, those of you who are here, attending in person or online, to think about projects that you're working on. You have time to plan it now to submit your proposals. We accept research proposals as well as teacher-focused proposals. So we hope to hear from all of you. When we have our spring colloquium, we look for colleagues who are doing fantastic work, who are not in the state of South Carolina. And tonight is no different. We have a renowned speaker, and I know you will enjoy hearing from her once she gets going here. But I'm going to first turn the floor over to one of our wonderful students who will introduce our speaker. She'll introduce herself as well as the speaker, and then we'll listen to the talk. Following that, we'll open the floor for question and answers.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antonia Awinawi. I'm a fourth-year PhD program in the Department of Teacher Education, Language and Literacy. And I would like to welcome you all once again to this amazing event and for joining us for what promises to be an insightful and thought-provoking conversation. It is truly an honor to introduce Dr. Lisa Dorner. Dr. Dorner is a professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and she's the director of the Cambio Center. Her scholarship focuses on the politics and the planning of bilingual education, educational policy enactment, and the lived experiences of immigrant children and families, particularly in relation to family-school engagement and language brokering. Dr. Dorner is deeply committed to working alongside communities to disrupt inequities and strengthen opportunities for multilingual learners. She co-founded the Missouri Dual Language Network in 2014 and has led numerous collaborative initiatives connecting educators, researchers, and communities to support bilingual education. From 2017 to 2022, she co-led the U.S. Department of Education National Professional Development Project, titled Strengthening Equity and Effectiveness for Teachers of English Learners. She has also helped design national conversations around critical consciousness in bilingual education, supported by the Spencer Foundation, and is currently co-leading the development of the Midwest Dual Language Alliance. Her work has been published in leading journals such as AERA Open, American Educational Research Journal, Educational Policy, Language Policy, and TESOL Quarterly. So we're fortunate today to have Dr. Dorner with us, and we look forward to learning from her insights and experiences. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Lisa Dorner.
Thank you so much. I had a lovely lunch today with some of the graduate students and a wonderful breakfast and exploration this afternoon with Dr. Sarah Brown over there. So thank you so much for inviting me here. This is such a special opportunity and super fun also to know that I think I have some friends out there in the world who have joined us online. So today I'm going to talk about really work that is not my own, that is with collaborators, as you were mentioning. About making critical consciousness the foundation of bilingual education. And then I'm going to give a case study in the Midwest that I and some other collaborators have worked on to try to think about well, what does this really mean? What does this really look like? Okay, so let's see. This is our agenda. So we're going to do quick introductions, but then I really want to define dual language bilingual education. What do I mean by that? What do you all mean by that? Talk a little bit about the argument and sort of the theories behind and the actions behind what it means to do critical consciousness in dual language or bilingual education. And like I said, I'll talk about a case study from the Midwest, and then we're going to do a book raffle. So sorry for the people who aren't here. Yeah, I was able to get a couple of these books from the publisher, so we'll see how that works out at the end. Okay, so introduction. So I myself, Lisa, am originally from Chicago, Illinois area. And I'm working right now sort of around where that star is. And I love this map. And for you all to maybe explore, I don't know exactly what are the native lands that we are on today, and all of the indigenous languages, right? Over the years that were developed and used and born on this land. So I just wanted to take a quick note about that. As you mentioned, I am in Columbia, Missouri. It's where I'm based as a professor, and I direct the Cambio Center. So Cambio, in Espanol, means change. So we study and think about demographic change over time. Of course, demographic change also means linguistic change. And this is a Indigenous land acknowledgement that we have on the Cambio Center website. I was told that this is the only land acknowledgement that anybody could find connected to University of Missouri right now, but it was written alongside some Native American folks that we work with within our College of Education. So I just encourage you to read it, think about it, but then also think about where we sit right now here in South Carolina and all the histories that brought you and also all of us here together today. Okay, so defining dual language bilingual education. I specifically keep, and by I mean my friends also that are in this book with me here, but we like to use this phrase dual language bilingual education to keep this idea of bilingualism front and center, and not just say, you'll hear all kinds of words used when we think about bilingual education in the United States, right? So there's transitional bilingual education from the 60s. There's two-way immersion, there's dual language immersion. You hear that out of North Carolina, you hear foreign language immersion education, all of these different terms. But we have thought about kind of thinking about this umbrella term of dual language bilingual education, meaning programs, right? Educational programs in schools that promote a kind of dynamic bilingualism where students are experiencing cultural and linguistic diversity, but most importantly, right, where the content is delivered in a target language. And in this case, in the US, we mean and this will be different in different places of the world, but it means a non-English language, right? So that we're seeking bilingualism, meaning English and another language, the target language being the non-English language. So a DLBE or dual language bilingual ed program would be one that spends at least 50% of the day in instructional content using that target language. And of course, we're working toward, as any educational program, instructing, the same grade level standards as peers are getting in a non-bilingual program. Now, there's all kinds of different ways, like I said, foreign language, world language immersion, dual language. Really, I think a key thing to think about when we think about defining bilingual ed is this idea of, is it a two-way kind of program or a one-way program? And usually those terms, not always, but usually they're defining who the student population is, right? So a lot of the work I've done has either been in two-way programs or one-way programs. In two-way programs, you're generally the program, the district, the school is trying to mix students from at least two different language backgrounds. So you might have predominantly English-speaking students from English-speaking homes and then another language. And a lot of times, those are kind of, maybe their aim is to split the student population 50-50. So for example, the most common two-way bilingual ed programs in the US tend to be English-Spanish. There's a long history of such programs in the DC area, in Florida, in Chicago, in California. And so those Spanish-English programs would do content material in at least 50% of the day to a mixed language group of kids, right? And the idea is this heterogeneous grouping, they learn from each other as well as they learn from the instruction. Now, one-way programs, and I've also worked with, my case study today is from what I would call a one-way foreign language or a one-way world language program, where the student population is predominantly English speaking homes, right? The students are from English-speaking homes or predominantly English-speaking families. And the goal is to immerse them. So this is where you get the idea of immersion a lot of times, right? The goal is to immerse them into another language and, maybe starting at kindergarten and developmentally, working them through to bilingual and biliteracy. Now, even though I say there's these general student groupings, how many of you have worked in a two-way or a one-way program? And is it ever that simple or perfect when you think about the language backgrounds and language varieties and Englishes and other languages you have in your classroom, right? So these are simplistic sort of definitions. There's often a lot of variety within the students that you meet within any classroom. I will say there's another kind of one-way program that's very common in Texas, and that another word for that kind of program is a developmental bilingual ed program. So in Texas, I learned from my friends who have worked there, one-way programs can mean one-way programs for predominantly like Spanish speakers to be immersed in Spanish, almost in a more transitional bilingual ed approach in the sort of traditional model of bilingual ed in the US that came out of the 1960s. So that is also a one-way program, if you will, because it's mostly one language group that you're working with, and you're immersing them, this time in Spanish and English together, to work on their bilingualism by end of elementary school into middle school. And then the last thing that we think about in all of these models, you can have this mix of, well, how much of each language at which point in time? So you'll hear the words 90-10, 80-20, 50-50 are kind of common. So a lot of, I think, dual language, bilingual ed or immersion programs these days try to start out in kindergarten. Well, shouldn't say a lot. There is certain areas in the United States that try to start out with the 90-10 model, meaning like, let's immerse in this target language as much as possible. Basically try to have everything except maybe your English language arts class and maybe an art class, or the PE class, right, would be in English. Everything else is in that target language. Sometimes those programs then gradually move toward 50-50, meaning 50% of your day, more or less, is in English, 50% is in the target language by the time you are in fifth grade if it's an elementary program. Again, of those of you who have worked in these programs, right, you've heard these terms before. Does it actually work out like, hey, my program's 90-10? Is it actually 90-10? Maybe not. Like, again, it's complicated. There may be a goal with kind of trying to allocate language, but then there's all kinds of things that impact it. Do you have the teachers in the content area who know that language well, who can teach in that language? All of these things actually impact what that student's life looks like in that program. But these are the key things that we're thinking about when we're trying to define what is a dual language. Now, I think in the room here, I'm speaking to a lot of people who already know all this, but these benefits of bilingual education. So bilingualism matters, right, is why we are here today. And that's because we know that students, K-12 students, and well-implemented programs, and I will say that's probably key, it's a really well-designed and implemented program, they're more likely to have all kinds of terrific outcomes, not only bilingualism and biliteracy, ideally, right, but graduating from high school, moving into advanced placement kind of courses or the like in high school, having positive attitudes towards school bilingualism, greater understanding and appreciation of other cultures. And so this comes from a range of work. This is only a few, but there's newer stuff that, of course, continues to think about these benefits in a whole variety of ways. So I like this quote from Jennifer Steele in what I think is one of the best sort of quantitative studies demonstrating program effectiveness, especially for kids who are designated as English learners, who are the kids who come from multilingual homes and come to school needing to develop English and having that access. So she writes, promoting equitable access to these programs seems critical to ensure that academic benefits are fairly distributed within a community. So back in 2015, she was thinking about like access to language immersion, dual language bilingual ed from early childhood really could become the next frontier for or in the struggle for educational opportunity in America, like really thinking carefully. We can have a conversation about where are we Deb Palmer, Dan Hyman, and others in this 2017 article, we did a review specifically of two-way immersion programs. So these are the 50-50 kind of split bilingual ed programs And there was so much research documenting the challenges, right? So while we know well-implemented programs have amazing outcomes, we really ended up situating this lit review and looking at, wow, there's this whole base of literature saying, well, really some very unequal access, especially for racially and linguistically diverse students. So if you think about it, a lot of language immersion programs that have grown over the recent past, they may be charter schools, they may be magnet programs, they may be in particular neighborhoods. They don't necessarily provide access to the bilingual education programs to everyone, right? So we think about it at the student level, there's challenges. There's challenges at the classroom level. So we were talking at lunch today about how, yeah, I was a teacher in a bilingual program. I created all of the materials, right? The curricula, while it may exist in places in the world, right, it doesn't necessarily exist in these very localized contexts. So there's a lot of challenges with curriculum creation, but also thinking about culturally sustaining classroom materials, right? So that actually are representative of the groups and the diversity that you have in your classroom. We need more teachers, right? So I just was telling some folks, I took part in language advocacy days last week in DC. And one of the things we talked about was the fact that Missouri as a state, we need world language teachers. We don't have enough world language teachers to fill our programs. And we have some districts where their ratio of designated English learners to a TESOL certified teacher is like 100 students to 1. That's not possible to provide the right kind of information. So that's not even a bilingual program, but we lack certified teachers. We don't have a bilingual certification in the state of Missouri. Do you all have it in South Carolina? You have certification to be a bilingual teacher. You have like ESOL or TESOL, but people have to combine that, right? You have to.
Never heard.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the same as Missouri. You have world language, right? So then people you have to think about, but the way we think, right? World language programs is not quite what you need in kindergarten. Yeah, bilingual teachers. So there's different things. There's marginalizing experiences. So at the family level, you see challenges in equity. And then of course we have, and this remains really strong ever since the 2017 article, maybe even more challenging, where the accountability policies, the discourses around monolingualism and the divisive politics really make it difficult to create equitable and sustain equitable dual language programs. Now, I made these slides for a different talk a few years ago. I can't find updated data on this. So all of the graduate students watching this, here's a research question for you. How many K-12 students, and maybe designated as multilingual learners or designated English learners, how many of them have access to a bilingual program? So in 2003, someone who tried to estimate this came up with only 17%. I think the number is probably not increased, even though the number of bilingual ed programs have increased. So maybe it's increased slightly, but my guess is maybe not so much. And it's very uneven, right? So in certain areas where you have so many opportunities for bilingual ed, maybe Minneapolis, St. Paul has a lot of language immersion programs. Areas in Texas, Austin, Texas has a lot. So that number is going to look a lot different. But in Missouri, our multilingual learners don't have hardly any access at all to bilingual programs. So this is an interesting question about how accurate this number is currently. I actually asked AI. I don't usually like to use AI, but I tried to create a really good question, and AI agreed with me. We don't really know this. We don't track. There was a Thomas and Collier study that I believe was in a statewide study in North Carolina. And so another thing that we have is an inequitable access for racially diverse youth. So I looked particularly at Black students in this study and how many of them in their different charts and graphs of this study, like how many of the dual language bilingual ed students in this particular study were Black. And so there were 24% that were Black in comparison to their non-DL sample population, they were 39% Black. So you see that like there's not the same percentage or number of Black youth that have access to or are choosing, or it's not in their neighborhood schools, right? This opportunity to go in programs. But we still have these equitable issues. Okay, so then my colleagues and I, as we had written that 2017 review of the literature that really helped us understand, or the way we grouped it, right? What are these different challenges that are facing bilingual education in our country, and what can we do about it? So I don't know how many of you have studied or read of, the Center for Applied Linguistics information about bilingual education, and they say we have 3 goals. We have these 3 pillars, if you will. And there's a I didn't reproduce it here, but there's like the actual Greek pillars. There's this image that they use, this graphic, and they talk about, well, a great bilingual program, we're going to develop bilingualism and biliteracy. That's a main goal. We're going to go for high academic achievement. That's a main goal. And we're going to create, whether it's called sociocultural competence or biculturalism. These are our 3 pillars of any great bilingual program. And we were like, well, we think there should be a 4th goal. We think there should be a 4th pillar, critical consciousness, because if we're going to try to address these challenges and these equity issues, we got to do something else than just keep thinking about these 3 goals. And then as Deb Palmer and Claudia and Dan and I were having many Zoom meetings over COVID, I think, as we were working on some of this, we're like, well, eventually we were like, well, is it another pillar, or is it actually, should it really be the foundation? So we started thinking, and I think a colleague of Deb's created this image where it's like, okay, what kind of image would we create to think about this idea of being conscious, of raising our awareness of what these issues are and how we can combat them, address them. We think we need that as a foundation. Okay, well, what does it mean? What do we mean by critical consciousness? So the woman who also created the cover for our book, Martha, created this image thinking about, well, what does consciousness look like? And it can also be beautiful. And we're really drawing from Paulo Freire here, right? So we're learning to perceive and trying to, go after understanding the social, political, and economic contradictions, but not just to critique, not just to name. So we can become conscious of things, but taking action is really critical, as all of you who have studied Freire and others know, right? So taking action against the oppressive elements of this reality, doing something about it. That's our next step, was sort of brainstorming. Well, if that's the case, taking action, then what does developing critical consciousness look like across all these different levels we talked about? For students, for teachers, for curriculum development, for families, policymaking. And our first article thinking about this was published in 2019, and we came up with these four actions. So we drew a lot from Freire and some similar authors to come up with these 4 actions. These are the ones I'm going to kind of walk us through a little bit today. You'll see maybe how they pop up in my case study example. But Dan Hyman especially has thought about others beyond this, and so have others as they've written about this. So this is certainly not just like a recipe book. Here's your 4 actions, now you're good, right? It obviously goes beyond this. But I'm going to talk us through this idea of historicizing, critical listening, embracing or engaging with discomfort, and interrogating power. So what does historicizing mean? So thinking about the lands we are on in some way, right? And the languages that came before us and the many languages in this room, that is historicizing, right? Understanding how the past has been explained and then foregrounding community histories and ways of knowing. But it's also personal. So it's not just understanding the community, but it's also like, well, what is my language background, right? So it's myself, let's say, recognizing that I grew up in a Chicago suburb, a lot of multilingual friends and families, but predominantly only monolingual home, learned Spanish in high school, continued to study it in college, and I was praised for it. Like Nelson Flores talks about this, right? The white bilingual Spanish speaker who attempts, gets some praise for, oh, it's great, that's amazing, you learned Spanish. Whereas the bilingual Spanish speaker who's been bilingual their whole life is not getting that same kind of praise. So some of this personal historicizing is also understanding that about your own personal history with languages, what that means, and sort of uncovering that for yourself, but then also understanding, and we'll talk about critical listening, understanding what that history is like within your community. So what are the languages there? So this school that's becoming the new 2-way immersion program for your district, was there a bilingual program here before? Right? So my own German speaking grandparents in the early 1900s in Chicago, they had bilingual programs in the early 1900s, right? That they went to way in World War I for a whole variety of reasons, right? And they were told quite specifically by their family members, do not speak German. Streets of Chicago. But the schools, we've, and especially in the US in different areas, we've erased this fact that we are bilingual. We have bilingual histories. What are those in your particular school area, community, and for yourself? As we're doing this work, we also think critical listening is important. So this is engaging the students, educators, family. It's creating meaningful, transformative connection, right? So it's being curious. It's attending to things, especially for people who are part of the more dominant culture, teachers, professors. We like to talk a lot. We need to be quiet more. There's a reciprocity or responsivity. So we think this idea of listening is really important. But it also means if someone is from a group that is typically silenced, right? It's listening also, but it's also being willing to amplify and understand that, trying to work with others as they're trying to amplify silenced voices. So not everybody should only listen all the time, right? So it's we're trying to figure out how to think about this idea of critical listening, not only from a dominant perspective, if you will, right? So it's my job to listen more maybe, but what about someone who comes from a more marginalized community? What's the parallel there? So that's something I would love your ideas on. Being critically conscious, resisting power, politics, not going to be comfortable. Engaging with that discomfort, embracing that discomfort, learning from the unsettled feelings that we might have when we're thinking about privilege, when we're thinking about what's been silenced and how to bring forth new stories. We wanted to think about this idea that yes, and recognize it will be uncomfortable. So we call that engaging, or sometimes we say embracing with this. And then this is, I think, the action that you'll see come up in my case study the most, this idea of interrogating power. So we still have a lot of, school community practices that really privilege the white, the English, the monolingual norms that is sort of buried deep, right, within a lot of communities in the United States. So it's questioning that. It's seeing where that pops up, who holds power in this place, how they obtained it, calling out, naming some injustices as you see them. This is where that might get uncomfortable, right? But we have to do that in order to transform systems. So I just had a wonderful walk through the Anne Frank Center on campus, right? People, right, in these really challenging moments who stood up, who called out an injustice, who said something, who interrogated the power. There are a great, does anybody listen to NPR, This American Life? This American Life is a podcast on NPR. It comes out of WBEZ, Chicago. But they have a couple great episodes of people in our current moment right now who are lawyers who used to work for ICE or still work for ICE, who are finding all out injustices. That's hard work, and that is, but it's necessary. Even in our development of bilingual ed. So, okay, I'm going to pause there for a second. How are we doing on time? 5:01, good. I got about 15 minutes to get us through our case study. Okay, so this case study is from a chapter called Dueling Discourses in Dual Language Schools, Multilingual Success for All versus the Decline. That is from the study data itself of Black students. And this is a chapter that I wrote with colleagues at the university, Jongmin Moon, Edwin Bonney, who's now at Clemson, South Carolina, and Alexandra Otis, who's still in Missouri. And it's in this book by Nelson Flores, Amanda Sang, and what's her Nick? Subtirelilu. Probably didn't get his name right. And this comes from work that data I collected about 10-ish years ago now, I think. Time is going by very fast, getting more gray-white hair. Time is moving on. But I thought that, I don't know that I've ever actually presented this particular chapter. It was a chapter that I saw the call for the book, that was focused on taking a racial linguistic perspective and context. And I thought, you know what, I think we have a story if we dig back into this data from this context. So what was the context? So this chapter is about dual language, bilingual education, network of charter schools that was actually started in the mid, I don't know what you would call it, 2000s to 2010s-ish. It was a one-way program, meaning it was designed primarily thinking about English dominant speakers being immersed in other languages. So there was a Spanish, a French, and a Mandarin school that were this network of charter schools. They started out, or they claimed, right, their goal was they were going to start out as 90-10, so really immersing students almost entirely in the target language of their school in kindergarten, first grade, and then like second, third grade, I think they said, oh, we'll be like 80-20, and then maybe fourth, fifth grade, they would switch to a 50-50. The founder, who became a close working partner of mine in the research and in community work we did together, was a Black bilingual French heritage speaker. And her focus really was on, she created opportunities for herself over her life to become bilingual, to reclaim her family's language. And she really wanted to make sure students within the context that we were in at the time would have that opportunity. So focusing on communities that didn't have access to bilingual education, and wanting to really create it for them. I can tell you all kinds of more stories about the development of the school. So ask me questions if you want to know. I will say that this was sort of the general demographic of the schools over time. And I think still is mostly a very similar demographic. So this original goal she had of at least the population to be served has continued to be served. But what were the equity questions kind of in this context? So over time, has anyone worked in charter schools? Tough places, right? So, charter schools, like there's, I am a proponent of public education. And charter schools are public schools. And sometimes when they're started by family members, they can be amazing spaces that provide something that a district public school doesn't. And I think this kind of space that I was working in really did have that at the start. But there were so many things that this school ran into in terms of challenges with their operations, challenges with their finances. And then in order to maintain their charter, right, they had to renew their charter every 5 years. And the goal in this particular state context was you had to be better on state tests. This is what the discourse eventually became. You had to demonstrate that you were meeting grade level standards on state tests to a higher percentage than your local public district was. That didn't mean you actually had to be doing that well, depending upon what your local district context was. But that's what the discourse became. Well, they struggled with that. And you might imagine, so in this particular context, you start doing standardized testing essentially around third grade, I believe. And in this particular context, unlike Texas, state testing was all done in English. But the students were in a 90-10 or an 80-20 program through third grade, and then they were getting state standardized tests. You imagine that they would have been meeting grade level standards? Maybe not. Maybe so, but it really varied. I mean, so it was an uphill battle to talk about that, to think about, well, can we have different assessments? This was not, the state policymakers were not interested in that conversation. So increasingly then, policymakers, meaning like the way this charter school was set up, you had to demonstrate your worth in like these annual reviews to your state sponsor in order then for the state to continue to approve your charter. And so the policymakers at this mid-level who were in charge basically of telling the nonprofit org that ran the schools what to do, they said, this dual language bilingual education program is not working. That was sort of the equity story here. And particularly they said, you said you had this goal on Black or low income or free or reduced students, and you're not meeting it. So you need to change things up. So in a look back at our data over about 9 years, we dug into the data and asked these questions of, well, what kind of discourses were defining the school's goals over time? and how over time, especially were Black students positioned within these conversations as the schools were competing, right? So there's this idea of competition in charter schools. You want to pull students in from the district public school. You want to remain open, but you have supposed declining or not good test scores. So this was the equity question. Were they providing good education for their student population? But then also, were the discourses around what the issues were, what did that look like in terms of how they were talking about their issue to the policymakers to stay open? So as I said, I think here what we did is sort of interrogated a bit of the power structure of what was happening within this school. So our framework, because we kind of came across like, let's do this analysis in order to fit into this book by, oh, and I forgot the third author's name there. Oh no, this is just the definition of racial linguistic perspective. So, so given that the book we were working on, to fit into that theme, we looked at sort of the different concepts that have been laid out by Rosa and Flores in terms of what is taking a racial linguistic perspective. And we came across these two concepts as we kind of worked iteratively between the data and reading different things, right? So I wouldn't say it was the, you know how it is in a talk. It's very neat and orderly. We went from a theory to an analysis, but this was really a back and forth process with our team. But the concepts that came up that we thought were really important is this idea of languagelessness. So that's this kind of portrayal of certain groups of people in this case, being portrayed as having limited linguistic capacity. So you'll see, I think the definition of this come through as I share some of it. Another key idea is this idea of standardization. So as I was saying before, like it's very common in the US, this idea of being monolingual, that's not normal. Like that's the basics. People don't expect an American to speak a language other than English, even though so many of us actually do. But monolingual is the standard against which other people are compared. And it also manifests itself very much in most of our states' accountability systems, right? So across the country. Now, these kinds of discourses, we decided we would analyze, or like I said, in our back and forth, we kind of looked at these discourses, but we also were looking for, well, what else is there in the data? And so this idea of equity does pop up quite a lot. And so let me talk a little bit more about the story as it'll kind of make more sense. So I'm going to talk in years, not the exact years to give you, but like year 1 to 6 of this program. So there was a lot of growth. So there were a lot of challenges within developing these 3 different schools. You can only imagine in this Midwestern area that didn't have any schools like this. They were trying to find qualified teachers with either TESOL certification or world language certification. They wanted to enroll students. They wanted to remain true to this demographic goal of serving mostly marginalized students from the Black community who hadn't had this opportunity before. So this was sort of this period of growth. Year 7 and 8, though, the school board, based on sort of responses they were getting from the state and their sponsor of the charter, the school board fired the executive director. So this founding bilingual director had this dream. They were like, you know what? You're having some financial issues. You're not meeting your student outcome goals. They had a fear of losing the charter at their next review, and they were like, you're out. It was a pretty big shock to the community. We could go into sort of a little bit more of the story, but that happened. They had interim leaders for this period of time, and then eventually by year 9, they had a new leader who changed the 90-10 model to a 50-50 model. Because they thought, you know what we're doing? Well, our kids aren't learning English. We need to give them more English. So the bilingual program and the immersive aspect became, oh, we know what the problem is. It's they don't have enough English. So students then had to demonstrate proficiency in English before learning in the L2, meaning the second language. So this radically changed the vision of what a bilingual program should be. The founder, who hadn't had a lot of experience before in creating dual language programs, did some research and found the Gomez and Gomez model. Has anybody heard of Gomez model. So my understanding is that model was predominantly created for heritage Spanish and Spanish speakers in a context. And so it's a 50-50 model, but mostly for Spanish speakers. And so they were looking at literacy for a particular group and saying, you know what, we want to make sure there's some level of home literacy in Spanish before we go on to learn English. Which might make some sense in the context that we're trying to fight against that dominant English world. So we want to make sure we give you this really good base in Spanish in your home language. So the leader of the school then applied that really interesting way for this school, which is, oh, the language lists mostly Black youth at the school now. Oh, actually, they're coming to school without English. We need to make sure they have English before they get to learn in Spanish. Okay, so you see the institutionalized racism seeping in here. Also in year 10, just to sort of note, you also see this movement of leaders of color and multilingual speakers away from the leadership of the school. So that no leader, all the founding leaders were gone, no leaders of color by year 10. I think that has since gone back and forth, but that was the situation. Okay, so what were my research methods? So I've kind of alluded to this. This was really a community engaged project where I worked with this particular set of schools during this like founding 10 years. So I wouldn't say it was exactly an ethnography, but a use of ethnographic methods in different ways to support the schools as they needed support on different questions. This particular study kind of came toward the end of that, where we really looked at documents. We weren't looking at the sort of ethnographic work. We knew a lot, having had been in the context, but we were really studying like, what were those founding documents? What was that charter renewal look like? The annual reviews that were done by school leaders and teachers and sent to the sponsor, you know, what did those look like? And then also, what did it look like from years 1 to 7 when the executive director of the schools would give an annual like state of the school report? What were the discourses that were buried in there? So we did critical discourse analysis of these different documents to really look at, so what do we mean by discourse? We drew from Faircloth, we drew from Jim G, thinking about like, what are those ideologies, right, that are represented by the language and the text? And Faircloth talks about these sort of ideologies. They're striving for that recognition, for that power. What is bubbling up in these documents? So we really reviewed that founding charter first to see what were the kinds of cultural narratives, what were the values that were being espoused by that founding documents. And then that's when we came up with, we're seeing some languagelessness. We're seeing a lot of social equity. We're seeing a lot of this sort of standardization in that founding document. So then we wanted to ask, like, are those things popping up in the rest of these documents over time? And so we asked these sorts of questions. You know, what were the school's values and goals over time? What kind of standards or proficiency were presented or valued? What and who was being measured? So this idea of accountability, of getting people up to a certain standard, what kind of data was being used? How were Black students in particular, since we had this equity question, and their languages or their linguistic proficiencies described over time? And then how were students positioned in terms of the school's goals? So those were just sort of those open questions that we were. Okay, oops, that number 4 shouldn't be there. So we really came up with, as you can kind of see from the theme here, we had sort of came up with these 3 ideologies over time. And these ideas, I have to say, really popped up. I'll show you a chart later. Over time within the data, that it was very clear from the founding documents and even the later leaders of the schools that multilingual education should be accessible and it should be open to all. So there really was a focus on continuing to try to provide bilingual education for students. But there was a lot of talk about this idea of an achievement gap or a language gap that negatively was impacting the education of, in particular, in this case, the students at the school. That were called low income in some areas, African-American, Black students as part of their demographics. And then there was a lot of talk about this idea that schools must be held accountable to standards. So in this case, a lot of talk about how to measure students' linguistic and academic proficiency, but this was something that also changed over time that we'll talk about. So I'm going to do 3 quick slides, so we do have time for questions that just show a bit of the data. what did social equity look like? So this is just a quote from the charter application. Each school will resemble a true multilingual society in which individuals interact in the languages which are most comfortable to them. So that was written in the founding document. It didn't play out necessarily in every day, especially as accountability policies came. Languagelessness, this is data from the original charter. This idea came through in other areas of the data, but there was this argument that the schools would help end word poverty. Is anybody familiar with that, like Hart and Risley research that said people from low-income homes or Black homes speak so many fewer words? That research has been completely debunked. There is some fabulous analysis of just how terrible that research is. If you're teaching research design, look at that study and talk about it. But it was a useful argument for the founder to say, oh, but we're going to change that, because we're not only going to be teaching English to students, they're going to get a whole nother language too. So we're really going to wipe out this poverty. But that discourse, what does that set up? That sets up a deficit discourse about the students. And then standardization came up in the founding documents, the 5-year charter renewal, and then also the annual reviews. And so there was a constant focus on, we need to be accountable to the state. We're measuring students, we're measuring teachers, they were measuring family engagement. Like, they were measuring stuff all over the place. But what mattered at the end was students' test scores in comparison to other students. And they weren't looking at linguistic proficiency. They said they were going to test and measure students, like, how are you developing your Spanish over time? Let's see how we're doing. The state didn't need those numbers. So at the end of the day, because of those accountability policies, the focus really became on English language proficiency as your standard, or how you're doing on standardized tests and math reading. But those tests are all hard. So these ideologies, led to arguments. They led to arguments about how we're going to develop the school. We had this equity argument that really was consistent over time. We need to measure everything, but it really turned out to be specifically really about students' proficiencies in English. And then this idea by year 9, we have to implement this new model because they named it, right? Black students particularly considered as being like highlighting, and this is what we're going to talk about in the next slide. Oh, well, we're going to talk about it shortly, but really highlighting students as the issue, not all these other issues that are also documented in the schools. So I know you can't see the gray color so good in this, but this bottom row is social equity. So we just sort of tried to map out the numbers of times, like the discourses were popping up in the different data. Social equity was constant, right? It was in all of the data, all of the years somewhere. Languagelessness came up in that word poverty, that argument at the beginning. But when the founder, the original founder was still there, it really didn't pop up that much until it really became the argument for changing the schools in the later years. And then standardization was all the way through, like, we got to measure. But then these ideas of standardization and languagelessness really intertwine in these arguments to change the model of the school by year 9. So here's a rationale for the change. This is some data from a letter in year 9. Why do we want to implement a different language immersion model? Answer: our students are not learning or growing in the basic subjects of English, math, and science. While the full language immersion model was compelling, over time it became clear that for the majority of our students, the new language skills came at the expense of learning all these other subjects. About 75% of our students enter below grade level. Test scores show our low-income students of color are not getting up to grade level as quickly as other students. This is called an achievement gap. Therefore, it makes sense to teach students to read in English first. So what this letter did that was sent out to the community, to the parents, first of all, if you're reading that, you're like, is that about my kid? Like, that's not making me feel good, right? But it's placing blame for this issue that the students are facing. I mean, yeah, the students in the school is facing on the students, as opposed to all of the other struggles. They didn't have special education set up. They weren't measuring students' linguistics performancy. They had all kinds of governance issues with their school board and the choosing of different leaders. Like, And our one friend who has worked at charter schools before, I don't know if it was a startup charter school, but it is tough to open up and start up a new school. So there's all these operational issues that don't get blamed, if you will, for the challenges that the students face. Instead, it's put at the foot of the students in the way they're talking about it. So just as one example, in the executive summary for the annual review of year 7, 22 lines of text suggested areas of improvement in the culture of the school, in the leadership, in the governance, in the finances. Only 11 lines went to student achievement. So do you see what I'm saying? Like, they were missing talking about, like, wait, maybe the system needs to change some. Not, oh, we're going to change this model because the model is not working for this students, and blaming sort of on this deficit perspective of students. Okay, so interrogation of power. I will say, as someone who was closely related to leaders in the school, even as they changed over time, I read a rough draft of this letter. And I actually did provide feedback to I challenged, right, and questioned, like, the deficit perspective on students, and the naming of students and how students were named within this letter. The director at the time did change the letter slightly. I was like, there was a little recognition, but the discourses remained strong, right? I also had conversations with the state sponsor, so the person, that the group of people, if you will, that were overseeing the review of the charter schools in order for them to renew their charter, and try to encourage them to look at the operational issues. Like, what about the operational issues? We can't say that this bilingual model has failed when we're lacking all these other things that a typical school district has, right? Can we start here first before we scrap this first? So I'll kind of leave it there, saying that, you know, really trying to think about how to understand the intersecting and racialized ideologies that are within the development of dual language school, how to really try to think about equity, interrogating our own discourses, right? Even if I go back and see my own discourses over time in this space, I'm sure we can critique those as well. And then trying to use those kinds of interrogations to raise questions with the policymakers and the educational leaders. Okay, so we have some time left for questions. I would love to hear more about what's happening in your areas, but I don't want to forget to do the book raffle. So to get the conversation going, whose birthday is nearest to February 21st, which is so I do want to thank all of you for engaging in this conversation tonight, but I really want to say, right, this work is very collaborative. This is not my own work. These were the folks who I've been working with for years on the idea of critical consciousness, doing the original lit review. And here are my friends who helped actually analyze the data and write this chapter, particularly on the data we talked about today. So, you know, a huge shout out to my collaborators and also the families and my research partners out there at these schools for years. It was really a privilege to be able to work with them and the teachers and the students there. So that's all. Thank you so much.